Good morning. Good morning and welcome. My name is Ross Lajeunesse and I lead international relations here at Google. We are incredibly pleased to be hosting this morning's launch of the Freedom on the Net report, something we have had the privilege of doing for the past few years. Google is a huge supporter and believer in Freedom House, not just this report, but Freedom House's work on freedom of the press, on the LGBT Dignity Fund, and its work all around the world to promote democracy and human rights. We are especially pleased to be working with Freedom House's new president, Mike Abramowitz, a man I consider a personal friend, as well as exactly the sort of leader that this organization needs to continue Freedom House's work, its relevance in the world, and the important role that it plays on a wide range of issues all around the globe. So with that, I'd like to invite Mike to come up and say a few words and thank all of you for being here and participating in the launch of this really great report. Thanks so much. Mike?
So thank you, Ross. Thank you for those very kind words, and thank you for your incredible support of Freedom House. We really appreciate it. And good morning to all of you. As many of you know, Freedom House has, for more than 75 years, has remained dedicated to the expansion of democracy and freedom around the world. The Freedom on the Net project provides us with a report card, if you will, of online freedom, a report card that looks at restrictions on content, manipulations of what appears online, and serious violations of user rights, such as unchecked surveillance. When this project began in 2009, and indeed when the internet and the web came into being, I doubt that anyone foresaw the issues we're confronting today. The assumption, the seemingly safe assumption, was that the net would be a democratizing force. Our Freedom on the Net report shows us that the net is increasingly being used to promote something. Serious violations of user rights. It's the Russian bots. Our Freedom on the Net report shows us that the net is increasingly being used to promote something quite different. It can be used not only to advance democracy and freedom, but to undermine it. And the effects on democracy and civil activism are potentially devastating. So this will be a large part of our panel's discussion this morning. The Freedom on the Net project would not be possible without generous support from many sources, and I want to thank the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Google, the German Federal Foreign Office, the Internet Society, Yahoo, and Golden Frog. I also want to thank our incredible Freedom on the Net team, headed by Sonia Kelly, for turning this project into one of our most important products. I'm eager to hear from our panelists, and to move us closer to that, let me turn the program over to our moderator, Ross Anderson. Ross is a senior editor at The Atlantic and is especially well suited to lead this discussion because he's the editor who oversees all of The Atlantic's coverage of technology. Ross, over to you.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I hope I won't impugn my journalistic credibility by saying I'm a big fan of Freedom House, so I'm sort of a biased observer. I want to introduce our panelists, and then I hope we have a fun conversation for you all. With me, as Michael said, to my left is Sonia Kelly, who is the director of this Freedom of the Net project at Freedom House. Sally Wentworth is to her left. She is the vice president for global policy development at the Internet Society. She was previously assistant director of telecommunication and information policy in the White House Office of Science and Technology, and also principal policy advisor on internet policy issues at the Department of State. To her left is Daria Orlova, a senior lecturer and deputy director for research at the Mohyla School of Journalism in Ukraine. She was a visiting assistant professor at Stanford's Center for Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies in 2016. And last but not least, Paola Riquarte is an associate professor in the School of Humanities and Education Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico. Her research interests include the impact of technology in social life in particular, and e-politics, digital activism, digital literacy, and open knowledge. Sonia, I want to start with you. In 2017, I sort of know better than to expect good news from any report that emerges into the world. But I found this one sort of particularly distressing, and I was hoping that you could sort of start us off by giving us a kind of zoom out on the major findings.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ross. Well, this year's report focuses heavily on the growing trend of government manipulating social media to undermine democracy. And we found that this can be done through diverse methods, through the use of paid pro-government commentators, through the use of political bots, through dissemination of fake news, also hijacking of social media accounts, and then also through pro-government propaganda online. We found that these types of online manipulation actually played a role in elections in 18 countries over the past year alone. So I think that's a really important thing to remember, because it seems like that most of the audiences are now focused on the manipulation in the United States and in Western Europe, but we see this being a global trend. And just to give you a couple of examples, in the Philippines, we've seen government employing keyboard army to create this sense of the support behind government's policies, and also toward the crackdown that's quite brutal on drug trafficking. We've also seen examples of this in Turkey, in Vietnam, and so forth. You will be able to actually see in the booklets that we have for distribution for everyone the list of countries that we examined, 65 countries, and where each of these techniques is being employed. But this issue of manipulation is not the only trend that we cover this year. There are others that are perhaps equally as disturbing. We've seen a huge increase in the number of internet shutdowns. And something that's been interesting over the past year is that more and more governments are actually focused now on mobile internet. In fact, over half of all of the countries that have instituted shutdowns have focused specifically on mobile internet and communications. And this seems to happen most widely in areas that are populated by ethnic and religious minorities. And it often has this profound impact on these communities that are already marginalized in these countries. We've also seen an increase in physical attacks against those who write critically of the government. And in fact, that's one area where the numbers are quite striking. Last year, when we looked at the number of countries where physical attacks were just simply writing about human rights happened, we were able to record 20 out of 65 countries. This year, that number has gone up to 30. And it seems like that those that are mostly affected are journalists, online journalists and bloggers who write about corruption and who are critical of the government, but mostly those who already have a pretty large following online and are able to disseminate their message effectively. We've also seen increase in cyber attacks against human rights defenders. And this is a growing problem, despite the widespread efforts to actually teach civil society and activists how to defend themselves. In part, this is a growing problem because some of the tools that enable this cyber violence are so easily available nowadays in this very loosely regulated market that it's no longer just the central governments who are doing this, but we've seen instances of the local police or the local mayor's office conducting surveillance against political opponents in their small towns. We've also noticed growing restrictions on live video. So this is also a new trend because only until a couple of years ago, not many people actually used live streaming, but now with Facebook Live and other social networks having their live streaming platforms enabled, more and more people are using live streaming, and we are now seeing governments taking notice and cracking down on this. So in places like Bahrain, for example, now news websites actually are prohibited from streaming live. And obviously, this is a huge deal in a country that has such tightly controlled media environment. And finally, we've seen increase in restrictions on VPNs. And I think within the human rights community, this is something that's quite important because many people use VPNs for evading censorship. And it seems like that governments are now passing new laws or are more eager to actually find technical methods to block those websites.
Sally, I want to go to you because I suspect you have a unique perspective from your years at the White House and the State Department thinking about issues like this. Hearing that sort of laundry list, the parade of horribles, how many of those are things that you all could see coming in recent years, and what's new and surprising in that report?
Thank you. And first, I just want to congratulate Freedom House and Sonia and the team for another great report. This is I think from our mind at the Internet Society, this is the go-to report on these issues and one that we rely on throughout the year for our outreach on internet freedom. So congratulations on that. You know, and thinking back on where the policy space was 10 years ago, I think the focus, we saw governments trying to use language, we would see it at the UN, for example, language to try to put boundaries around how far we could go with this internet experiment, right? And that there were responsibilities in trying to put some laws in place and regulations in place that would put boundaries around the technology. And that to us was really what we saw all over the world at the time, that people didn't really understand how the technology could be used and all the ways it could go, but they knew there was something here that was allowing people to say things that the governments didn't necessarily want to be said, that there was an empowerment mechanism that people were nervous about. And conversely, on the other hand, though, they saw that there was a technology here that could open their economies and provide tremendous opportunities. So there was this struggle going on, I think. What's, I think, become so clear in this report, and we saw it, I think, in last year's report too, is the level of sophistication by governments. And you know, there's technically savvy governments that we've known about, you know, in China and whatnot, that have been using savvier methods over the years. But the extent to which we see much more targeted attacks by a wide range of countries. I mean, you're talking about, you know, going up to 30 countries with a level of precision about what kind of speech they want to target, what kind of technologies they want to limit. And the ability to be that specific, I think, is the trend, right? So that they can somehow still benefit from the technology and the economics, at least I think that's the theory, but also shut down the things they don't want to have happening. The difficulty is, of course, that calculation doesn't often work. In Cameroon this year, we saw repeated shutdowns around political events that have huge rippling implications for their entrepreneurial sector. If you're an investor looking to invest in a market that continues to take the internet off, to shut it down, or to block access to certain things, that market becomes unattractive over time. So it's not just the momentary shutdown, but the long-term implications that we see. But I think this is a trend that has been coming, and I think the speed and, like I said, the sophistication is really alarming.
Daria, if we could sort of zoom in on Ukraine as kind of a case study. Ukraine was sort of singled out in this report as a place where internet freedom declined precipitously in the last year. Can you give us a sense as to what factors led to that?
Well, the major factor was the ban by the president and the government on the several Russian social media platforms and search engine and some other services. So that factor contributed enormously to the decline of internet freedom in Ukraine. There were some other factors like continuous persistent prosecution of social media users for expressing separatist speech and for questioning the borders of Ukraine, the territorial integrity. But then again, as I said, the biggest factor was this ban on the and blockage of the access to the Russian social media.
Was there a tension there, as we know in this country, given that Russians have in the past at least spread misinformation into the internet in foreign countries? I mean, is there an easy way out of this for the government in Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And when I said that about this factor that I mentioned, and Ukrainian government did receive a very fair criticism of that move. But on the other hand, we should also acknowledge the very acute challenges that Ukraine has been facing for the last 3 years, coming from some external actors, well, particularly Russia, of course. So the scale of the disinformation and propaganda has indeed been very impressive in the case of Ukraine. And I don't know, maybe the most recent example, just yesterday I saw a report by BBC that they managed to investigate the links between the so-called Olgino troll factory in Russia and production of anti-Ukrainian video content, and how they spread that across social media. So indeed, the challenges have been acute, and of course there is a big debate on how to handle those challenges, how to respond to those challenges. And so far, the decision of the Ukrainian government to ban those platforms haven't provided, like, I guess, the outcome that was expected or planned for, because still quite many Ukrainians use the Russian social media through VPNs.
Sure.
So, and then of course there is a big debate in Ukrainian society, but I should say that a significant part of Ukrainians, in fact, do support these restrictions because of the tensions, because the issue at stake seems to be very important to many citizens, but that doesn't mean that all the people, of course, are satisfied with that.
Does that suggest that any sort of sustainable solution, and I should open this up to our other panelists, but any sustainable solution to these problems are necessarily going to be global, or involve many government, like it would have to, Russia and Ukraine would have to come to terms on these.
Yeah, and it's not only about governments,
Yeah.
It's also about societies, right? And the response that societies and civil society and different publics should discuss and come up with some response.
Paula, give us a sense of the sort of the mood for journalists in Mexico right now. Again, I was distressed to read about Mexico in this report, and I also know there's a presidential election coming next year, and I wonder if some of the effects are sort of ratcheting up as a result.
Well, thank you very much. First, I would like to thank Freedom House, Sonia Kelly, and her wonderful team for this report. Well, I would like to begin saying that in Mexico, internet is used by the government as a surveillance and disinformation tool. This year, a group of civil organizations denounced the purchase of surveillance spyware by the government. And this is the third spyware scandal in the past 4 years. So this scandal made visible not only that we live in a surveillance state, but also that there is a set of networks of corruption involved in this surveillance industry. The argument to buy this spyware is, of course, insecurity and violence in Mexico. But despite of this investment, about $80 million since 2011, violence has not decreased. And we have witnessed that this spyware is used against human rights activists, journalists, human rights defenders, like people very well known, like the renowned journalist Carmen Aristegui, or, for example, the team of international investigators of the Ayotzinapa case, or even the Center of Human Rights, Miguel Agustín Pro Juárez. Those were among the targeted victims of surveillance. So in Mexico, any journalist, activist, human rights defender, or even academics are potential victims of state surveillance and of digital or physical attacks. During the first semester of this year, the organization Article 19 reported 1.5 daily attacks to journalists. And during this first semester, 6 journalists were killed. Also, there is another trend that was reported by this year's report, the use of bot trolls and hashtag poison and fake news that are part of the digital public sphere in Mexico since 2011, during the state elections of the state of Mexico. But this year, we have many more evidences, like technical and also scientific evidences, that these are regular practices used by the government and political parties to attack their opponents. In 2016, the Bloomberg Business Week published an article where the Colombian hacker claimed that he had been paid $30,000 to hack the accounts of Peña Nieto political rivals, to buy followers and control bots, to create fake trending topics, to create fake news, to simulate support for Peña Nieto. And also many other people from academia and also journalists have been denouncing these practices since then. These armies distract the public attention from issues that are important for the whole society. They create these artificial trending topics. And it also needs to be mentioned that in Mexico, activists, journalists, human rights defenders are systematically receive death threats on the digital space. The last thing that I would say that is that technical attacks against media outlets are also on the rise. And as Sally said, although these practices are not new, what we have seen is that now they are becoming more frequent, they are more complex, and they are more difficult to combat. So for us, it's a real concern because, as you said, next year we are going to have presidential campaigns, presidential elections. So as civil society, we have to be aware of these strategies because we know that they are very powerful to hack the elections.
Yeah, having now got a sort of quick lay of the land and how terrible things are, to the extent that we can sort of conceive of this whole thing as an arms race between would-be censors or otherwise restrictors of internet freedom and activists or civil society or even private companies, I hesitate to make this a good guys, bad guys thing, but among the good guys, who's being successful? I mean, who's striking a blow against internet censorship, and how are they doing it?
So for me, it's been quite interesting to observe how governments are trying to restrict the internet as more people go online and use it for activism and political expression. But then it seems like that in many countries, particularly countries that are, in what we call the yellow category, so countries that are partly free, where there is freedom to organize, there is some freedom of expression, but then the government is trying to place restrictions. We see that in those countries, it's actually civil society and activists who are trying to push back against the restrictions. So I would say that in many settings, they would be the good guys. So they would be the ones who are tracking what's going on. And then if there is something that can endanger their freedoms, they try to organize campaigns, they try to bring the issue to public attention, and so forth. To which extent they're succeeding, that's a different question. Because when we track these issues, it's been interesting to observe that we see unprecedented amounts of activism. And we also see so many victories when it comes to successful campaigns. Yet internet freedom continues declining. So it seems like that, that's almost a cat and mouse game where governments are trying to restrict it, then civil society tries to push back, then government restricts it some more. And from that perspective, it is an arms race. Again, in terms of the good guys, there are governments that are not perfect, but they are trying to promote the basic tenets of internet freedom internationally. For example, some of them are members of the Freedom Online Coalition, which is an international multilateral organization that has about 30 government members, and they are dedicated to at least trying to promote some internet freedom norms internationally. We've also seen, in terms of good guys, the technical community, and Sally here can speak a little bit more about that, where some of the engineers who are maintaining the integrity of the network, I think they're taking notice how some of these restrictions are popping up and how some of the tools that they created are actually being used. And I know that they're proactively looking for ways to resolve that.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as you were speaking. Part of the Internet Society is we work closely with and are aligned with the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is where the technical protocols of the Internet are developed. And shortly after the Snowden revelations about the pervasive monitoring, pervasive surveillance that was going on both in the United States but around the world, the engineering community really sat up and took notice to say, okay, what are the technical components that need to be in place in order to allow people to communicate anonymously where appropriate, securely, and all the rest. And the Internet Architecture Board at the time came out with a very strong statement in support of end-to-end encryption, so that the transmission all the way from device to device or user to user would be encrypted along the path. This is not magic. This is not the push of a button. There's a lot of technical work that has to be done to make that possible at a lot of different layers. And we're starting to see a lot of that being rolled out. Unfortunately, at the same time that these things are becoming available to people to communicate freely, to secure their transactions, encryption is getting a bad name in the press, right? And we see this in your report, that governments, even what we might consider the enlightened governments in this country, in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, are really taking a hard look at encryption and saying things about, we need special access, we need the keys, we need some way to be able to unlock these transmissions. And it creates this real challenge for people to think through about legitimate law enforcement requirements of, being able to, quote unquote, get the bad guys. And on the other hand, the need for encryption is not just sort of on or sort of off. It's you're either encrypted, your transmission is encrypted or it isn't, and so it's not sort of encrypted. And so there's a real concern that by starting to chip away at the very tools that would protect the communities that need to be protected that you're talking about, that at the same time we are undermining those as a matter of law. And we see that on the rise in this report, and we're seeing it all over the world.
How are, it's my sort of, as a layperson looking at this from some distance, it seems to me that the sort of leverage and appeal of some of the tech giants, like our distinguished hosts, has diminished in the last year as they've come under fire for various political reasons related to, be it the election or antitrust concerns or whatever it may be. Does that make them less effective as they go out globally to try to push these norms on their own behalf?
I think this is a real challenging year for everybody in the internet space. I think a lot of the things that we have held dear in terms of openness and free expression and being able to trust the content that we're looking at online have really come. We're being asked to question all of those, so I think, I mean, we see Google and Facebook and others in I think a tough spot. I would say it is interesting to me to see them taking a more proactive stance in terms of the responsibilities they have to their users. I don't imagine that these companies want to be in the business of delivering bad information. I don't think that's the customer promise that they have, or customer service promise that they've delivered. So I think there's every interest to deal with these things, but it creates. I was asked a couple days ago. It creates a real challenge for us as end users, right? Who are we comfortable with telling us what is fake and what isn't? Where are we willing to cede that authority to? Is it to the government? Some countries may not want to do that, right? Is it to a big internet company? Where are we willing to cede that authority if we want somebody else to take care of this for us as end users? And so nobody's off the hook in this conversation, I think.
Daria, I wanted to ask you, going back to the sort of, speaking of arms races, you mentioned that the restrictions on Russian social media are quite popular in Ukraine, and yet people continue to use VPNs to circumvent them. Is there some concern that governments are becoming more sophisticated at working around VPNs? How's that arms race going?
Well, at least for the moment, there are no talks like that in Ukraine, so there are no, at least for the moment, there are no expressed fears that this might happen. But then even this actual decision on banning the Russian social media was quite a surprise for many people. I mean, like in expert community, in media community. So that was not something that was heavily discussed in Ukraine prior to the actual introduction. So I just wanted to make a remark regarding the issue whether the society supports or doesn't support this move. Of course, there is some sort of divide with regard to this issue. And when I said supporting, I would say that even, let's say, expert community is quite supportive. That I don't know whether it is surprising or not. Mostly, this move hasn't been supported by common people who have these very strong habits of media consumption, like social media consumption, that those particular social networks. So they felt that they are being deprived of an important element of their daily media consumption. So that would be like a brief picture in terms of public reaction to that. But as for VPNs, as of now, there are no fears really expressed, but who knows, the situation develops quite dynamically.
Paola, give me a sense in Mexico as to how private industry, so are tech companies in Mexico, are they allies to Mexican journalists or Mexican citizens, or have they been sort of happy to fall in line with the government on issues of surveillance or what have you?
Well, we cannot speak in general because,
sure.
For example, last year, the government increased the number of requests information to the tech companies. And some of them just gave the information and others didn't. So there are tech companies, for example, well, I can tell you Twitter has been heavily criticized because they are not acting as we would like as a civil society. For example, because this emergence of bots and trolls is really, it really threatens free speech and democracy. So we would like to see tech companies more involved in the defense of the digital public sphere. Companies like Google have are giving funding to some small organizations, digital rights organizations, to do research, for example. And that's something good for us. But we can say that there are different approaches to that situation.
Sonia, I want to come back to you and ask, I mean, sometimes this subject, I find it quite appealing, but sometimes people regard it as being sort of wonky or something that requires a lot of expertise to dig into. And I wonder how the role that misinformation, potentially foreign government directed in America's recent election has helped you guys. Does that shine a light on your work? Or is it sort of, do you find yourselves getting lost in all the noise around this issue?
I think that's a good question, and in fact, it's probably the question for our communications director, who can tell you whether it has been a good or bad thing. But I think for me, actually, it's been quite interesting to observe how through the years, and I've been with the project since the beginning, how through the years we've documented different types of internet controls. So for example, one year it would be governments passing new laws, and then the following year, it would be increasing the arrests. And then now that we see that some of these punitive measures and arrests are not really having an impact to completely suppress free speech, we then see that governments are taking up new techniques and they're able to just flood the conversation. So I would say that I'm very pleased that we are able to contribute to the current conversation about these issues, and if anything, showcase that this is not just the issue of the United States and Western Europe, but this is a global problem.
But if I could on that, at least in the past, the discussion that I've experienced if it was in the US or in Europe about internet freedom, is that the challenges and the places where internet freedom is being attacked or suppressed are somehow over there. They're over there in Africa or in China or in the Middle East. They're not here in our beloved democracies, and we're fine. And I think, if anything, the report this year and the experiences in the United States and elsewhere really bring to light the fact that none of us can take this for granted. These are decisions that we as society take about what we're willing to accept. And I think in democracies in particular, as citizens, as end users of the internet, we have to take this extremely seriously. This is not happening over there. This is on our doorsteps, and I think, if anything, the events of the last year have shown us how vulnerable we could be and how we should all take this seriously. And I worry sometimes that in the US, we're just still so used to the fact that we have this in our homes, we have incredible infrastructure available to us, it's largely affordable, and we're just not as sensitive to it. And I'm not sure the companies, the industry is as sensitive to these issues as we should be.
And I will just add to that. I have a friend from Bahrain, an activist in Bahrain, and I was talking to her just the other day, and she said, oh, now finally you guys in the US are experiencing these things. I've been talking about this for years.
Right.
And of course, with the Bahraini government being one of the pioneers of actually using social media and Twitter in particular to just flood the discussions.
Yeah.
Well, I feel greedy getting to ask all the questions up here, so I'd like to open it up to anyone in the audience. If there are any questions for our panelists, just raise your hand and we will. Ah, yes, this gentleman in the back.
Hi, I'm Adrian Karmazin with the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, and my question is for Daria. Do you find that Ukraine is restricting in any way Western social media, Facebook, anything like that, Twitter, or is it just the Russian social media that's experiencing those restrictions? And are you finding that the Russian social media that has been banned, are they making any efforts to address trolls?
Can you repeat the second part of the question, please?
Oh, the second part?
Yeah.
So the way that Facebook is trying to address disinformation, are the Russian social media sites trying to address disinformation?
Okay, thank you. So as for the first question, it is only several Russian media services that have been banned. So the ban doesn't touch any other social media like Facebook or Twitter. There are attempts to manipulate the debate, so getting back to this general trend that the report identified, we can also find that in Ukraine, and those attempts come both from external actors and from internal actors. I wouldn't say that there is strong evidence that government itself is very much engaged in that, rather various political actors, because political environment is really competitive in Ukraine, but competitive not only in the positive sense, but also in a negative sense. So there's the rise of populism and tensions, many tensions, and struggle for the to get some control, etc. So there are attempts by those actors to manipulate the debate online, but also attempts coming from Russia. One example would be that one media report identified a network of Russian trolls that pretended to be like Ukrainian patriots. Even the symbol, the avatars, the profile pictures had references to Ukrainian flag, etc. And so the idea was that they spread the messages that Ukraine is going the wrong way and we need to organize the third Maidan, so another uprising. And so that was an attempt to add to this, to destabilize the public discourse, and not only discourse, but also the actual activities. As for your second question, I'm not really sure. I do not closely follow the debate in Russian media, in Russian social media. I haven't come across the reports suggesting that the Vkontakte or Odnoklasniki are trying to somehow respond to the fake news in a way that Facebook and Twitter have been starting that discussion.
I quickly actually just wanted to add, just hearing Daria talk about Ukraine and different measures that the government has instituted in order to fight this disinformation problem, and is the fact that we've seen in our research that many governments are really trying to tackle this issue, and it's a serious issue. But in 14 countries, we actually found that in an effort to combat this, governments have actually restricted internet freedom. So I think Ukraine is a good example of that, where in an effort to essentially combat Putin's propaganda, Ukrainian government started using some of the Putin's techniques, and that's a big, irony of that. But we've seen that also in places like Germany and elsewhere, and I think that's a good wake-up call that measures that are necessary in order to combat this extremely serious problem need to be well thought out, and they should not restrict internet freedom. That's the basic.
Any other questions for our panelists? Oh yes, one in the back there.
Good morning, Sheikh Liusi, journalist from Maghreb Voices, website for the countries in North Africa. In the report, I have a question for Kelly. In the report, you put Tunisia, Morocco, and Libya in the same level. Can we consider these countries with different experiences? We know that Tunisia is had a revolution in since 6 years, and Libya has a civil war now. Can we consider the two countries in the same level? Also, I have a second question. What are the common restrictions on the freedom on the net between these three countries? Thank you.
So let me just mention this, that although those countries that you named are broadly put into what we call partly free category, there are huge distinctions in terms of how well they're performing our indicators. In fact, in addition to having these three broad categories, we actually assign a numerical score to each country. So then, although a country might be partly free, it might receive 32 points or it might receive 59 points. So there is a big, big range. And it's similar range that we see in some of the countries that you mentioned. So Tunisia would be, Tunisia is probably 20 points ahead of some of the other countries on that list. So I think that's an important methodological distinction. I think when it comes to issues in Tunisia, for example, I think for me it's been quite interesting to watch the incredible progress that the country has made. Because when we first started analyzing Tunisia, it was under the old regime, and the country had some of the worst restrictions on internet found anywhere. And now we had seen those restrictions melt away. But I think what's problematic about Tunisia is that many of the old laws are still there on the books, which is one of the reasons why Tunisia still does not score as a free country in our survey.
Yes, right here.
Hello, I'm Franek Večork. I'm from Belarus, Radio Free Europe, American University. My question is about live streaming and about VPN and all these technologies that help people and activists to survive. Actually, it's true that in Belarus, live streaming it became the resolution of the permanent blocking and attacking to independent media. And I think the shift is just because the website couldn't write anymore freely, and people just moved to live stream as the space which is not yet controlled. But how do you see the trend? Is it possible that governments around the world, Eastern Europe, everywhere, will be blocking by law live streaming? And the same question about VPNs, because we know that Russia is going to block finally VPN. But do you see that other countries will be following this example? Thank you.
Yes, so in terms, the answer is yes, 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 unfortunately. And when it comes to the issue of VPNs, I think a lot of people are focused on what's happening in Russia or China, but we are seeing that VPNs are becoming banned or partially banned in many countries. And it's quite interesting because restrictions on VPNs are actually quite unpopular, because VPNs are not just being used by civil society and activists. I mean, a lot of people within the society use VPNs. I mean, whether you're surfing at an internet cafe or whether you're a business person trying to connect remotely to your company's servers. So, we do see this as a very unpopular measure that the governments still take. But I will mention that very few governments actually ban VPNs altogether. But the trend is more along the lines of what we had seen in Russia, where there's almost like that we see in China, where there's almost a two-tier system of, let's say, government-approved VPNs and then all of the other VPNs. So then if you're a VPN that's not being registered by the government, then you're most likely going to be banned. Similarly with live streaming, I mean, as I mentioned, this is a new trend in terms of restrictions, but I think it's most present in countries where traditional media is very much restricted. So then alternative news sources are live streaming from popular events, from political protests during the election time to actually provide the alternative to state-run news. And unfortunately, the governments are taking the notice, and they're placing new restrictions. I think, I mean, you coming from Belarus, I think it's very interesting because we've seen, some of those dynamics going on in your country as well.
And I think what's disturbing is that the countries learn from each other, right? So what we see, in a few instances this year, my guess would be we will see in large measure in next year's report, right? It seems to be people try things out, and then it's like they talk to each other and decide this is effective. And I think the point that you made is about VPNs and it being unpopular to block them is really so important. I mean, these technologies are hugely important for protecting activists, for protecting the private speech of people who are threatened, but they are also critical to functioning securely online, right? And so it's not just all about protecting activists. It's not why we only have we have encryption or why we have VPNs. These are things that we're asked to use as part of our corporate life if we work in companies. That governments use to protect their information, and at the same time we're having this conversation about wanting to, or countries breaking these tools. They're also going out and saying, but we want our citizens to be safe online. We want them to be able to do e-commerce. We want to participate in the global economy. Well, if you want to participate in an online economy, the transactions have to be secured. And so these things should be hugely unpopular, and so it's a two-sided thing that we're seeing.
Oh, actually, right here. Sorry.
Can you tell us more about cross-border and cross-country? I think as the layman, we think of the free flow of information, but a lot of the scope of your work is delineating what happens inside a country versus what can cross over in these trends. Can you just give us a little bit more understanding, both in a regulatory sense, a technical sense, and how the report moves towards a better understanding of what's happening with Russian involvement in U.S. social networking?
Thank you for that question. I want to clarify that our report mainly deals with the events within country borders. But in our analysis of some of the issues within country borders, then we see how at times actors from abroad actually impact what's happening within a particular country. So that's obviously the case with Russian manipulation, or that was the case some years ago once we learned about NSA surveillance and the impact that had around the world. So I think one of the general trends that we had seen, and I think Sally mentioned this, is that a lot of governments are actually now learning from one another. And when we first started tracking these issues, particularly with the issue of manipulation, it was Russia and China who were the main instigators. And now, we saw manipulation techniques being done by 30 out of 65 countries. So I think this is a problem, but particularly kind of on this learning end, because certainly Russia and China are exporting their techniques, and some of the authoritarian regimes are quite eager learners.
But I think also what you see is these countries taking their concerns, because they recognize there's so much they can do at the territorial level, and they're taking these concerns to regional organizations, or as particularly the UN. And there's been a whole host of efforts for many, many years to put in broad regulatory constraints on internet traffic flows, and everything from trying at a taxation level, can we tax the data or the packets as they move around the globe, Of course, if you can tax the packets, then you can track and trace the packets. So it's like you get 1 for 2 or 2 for 1 there. So there's these efforts, or defining spam in such a way that it gets you regulatory oversight of content. And then more recently, these efforts on cyber governments trying to come together to create sort of cybersecurity norms. What's acceptable behavior in a cyber conflict and what isn't? What are the constraints that governments are willing to agree to around cyber acts of war? And can they come to some sort of common terms? So these are all things that are happening in the UN space for countries to try to grapple, where they're trying to grapple with what's happening at home, and they're taking it out into the UN and trying to find allies, and going so far in some cases as to ask for treaties or any sort of kind of binding rules.
All right. Unfortunately, we're out of time this morning, and I worry the Google squads might bust down the door at any minute and throw us out. But Sonia, Sally, Daria, and Paula, this was great. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.